Good evening, everyone. I am Sarannaya Bose, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Center for South Asian Studies, University of Hawaii. Under this theme, TMYS Review March 2023 will talk about language and provincial narratives. The topic for today is borrowing, mixing, and naturalizing language. We are honored to have Dr. Somrita Urni Ganguly, Dr. Sarmila Paul, and Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Dr. Somrita Urni Ganguly is a professor and award-winning poet and literary translator. She is currently the head of Department of English, Maharaja Manindra Chandra College, University of Calcutta. She was a Fulbright doctoral research fellow at Brown University and is an alumna of University of East Anglia's International Literary Translation and Creative Writing Summer School. Dr. Somrita also served as a judge for PEN America Translation Prize and an expert reader for the English PEN Translation Grant, the National Endowment for the Arts Translation Grant offered by the US federal government, and the National Translation Award US. Dr. Sharmila Paul is presently teaching as an assistant professor at the Department of English, Rani Birla Girls College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. She has been awarded her doctoral degree by the Department of English, University of Kolani, India, on translation studies in 2019. Her areas of interest are literature of the Renaissance and the Romantic period, translation studies, post-colonial studies, gender studies, film and media studies. Lastly, Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha is an associate professor, Department of English, Brahmanda Keshav Chandra College, Kolkata. Her areas of interest are British Romantic literature, Indian writing in English, the diaspora, Shakespeare adaptations in film. Dr. Pulugurtha has published in referred international and national journals in the Coleridge Bulletin, the Encyclopedia of Postcolonial Studies, Shakespeare in Indian Cinemas, Local Habitations, edited by Poonam Trivedi and Paromita Chakraborty, the Cambridge Companion to British Romanticism and Religion, edited by Geoffrey W. Barbo, among others. Now, I would like to start today's session. Dr. Sharmila Paul, I request you to please present your views on today's topic.
Thank you so much, Sharanya. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, TMYS, for inviting me today. So, I would like to focus today on one of the aspects that is a part of today's topic, that is borrowing. And borrowing is a very common phenomena in languages, between languages interacting in everywhere around the globe. So before I start with my topic, I would just to briefly state what borrowing is, and then a few aspects of borrowing, and I'll then go into the straight into the topic. So, borrowing generally takes place when two different languages come in close proximity and get the opportunity to interact to a certain extent. However, borrowing is not a neutral process as it may apparently look like. So, the process of borrowing words from one language to another can be considered at least from two viewpoints. The first is a psycholinguistic angle that reflects the needs of individuals. The second is a sociolinguistic angle that reflects the needs of communities. So, personal attitudes to the vocabulary are among the psycholinguistic factors that affect and modify the individual's motivation for or against borrowing from it. So, on the other hand, communal attitudes represent sociolinguistic aspects of language development through borrowing. Both are affected by linguistic and non linguistic factors. Linguistic factors include all the structural elements of the examined languages, that is, elements and linguistic rules which are similar to or differ from each other. Non linguistic factors such as those related to economics and politics, exert their influence in various manners according to specific political and social structures in each language community. So each language has its own seasoning of all these ingredients, including a unique history and contact with a particular set of foreign languages. Now, one of the main referring points on language borrowing is the analysis of linguistic borrowings by Einar Hugin. In this volume, he summarized all other earlier studies on borrowings and summarized them on the basis of previous research. So his purpose was to define the terminology used in the linguistic analysis of borrowings and to raise some hypotheses about the borrowing process. So the first hypothesis was that the use of words from two different languages is not a coincidence. Rather, the speaker either passes it from one language to another without a problem, or during a conversation uses one word, phrase, or sentence from one language to another. So, for this type of language use, he uses the term code switching, which is very familiar in the study of linguistics. The second hypothesis was that the resulting language is not a hybrid language compared to what we call as the pure language. In fact, he claims that languages borrow words, and any attempt to clear the language from the foreign elements is wrong. And the third hypothesis was that the term borrowing itself is a wrong term because it is a process that appears without the permission of the lender and it does not need to be returned. Hogan defines borrowing as a reproduction of forms in a language found in another language. So, borrowings, according to him, are considered models, actually, forms that include lexemes, morphemes, phonemes, and syntactical structures that can be borrowed. Now, in addition, he has also proposed other basic terms such as foreign words, hybrid words, cults, semantic borrowings, and so on. So, according to him, with the grammar of foreign words, there is a tendency to mostly borrow nouns and verbs. With the term linguistic borrowing, Hogan does not exclude cases when speakers of a language insert or spread elements from other language into another language other than their native language. So, this process is known as imposition or retention. We'll come back to this towards the end of my lecture. Now, in fact, the American structuralist Edward Sapir gives us a very interesting insight in his book called Language. There, he has emphasized upon the importance of language contact, and to substantiate his point, he mentions English language, which has a large number of words and productive language elements borrowed from French. He has also cited few examples to prove his point. So the examples that he has given are like the words princess, drunkard, then royalty. So the suffixes in all these words like EWS in princess, ARD in drunkard, and TY in royalty. These are few examples which he has shown that English has borrowed from French. He has further shown us that borrowing have not taken place in the opposite direction. So he sees no reciprocity of linguistic borrowings. According to him, the way a language reacts to foreign words by accepting, translating, or rejecting them can reveal its formal tendencies as well as the psychological response of speakers who use it. Now, in addition to Sapir, Bloomfield also distinguishes three types of borrowings: cultural borrowings, intimate borrowing, and dialect borrowings. So, cultural borrowing includes borrowed words together with concepts, themes, or new ideas. Intimate borrowing, on the other hand, means the use of two or more languages in the same geographic area or in a similar political community, where the so called high language becomes a source of borrowing for a language with a lower sociolinguistic status. And dialect borrowing includes the process that takes place within a language where the words are borrowed from the standard language in dialects and vice versa. Or the dialects can borrow words from each other. Now, one of the most noticeable effects that appear in languages in contact or in bilingual situations is the borrowing of lexical elements. So, one of the sociolinguistic characteristics of borrowing is that in most cases they are one way. That is, lower prestigious language speakers borrow words from a higher prestige language. Hence, a psycholinguistic feature that separates borrowing from code switching is that not all the speakers using borrowed forms need to be bilingual. So, if we start looking deeply and keeping all these in mind, we start analyzing few situations and shift our focus to the Indian context, then we'll see that often, in many cases, the new words that have entered into English from other languages could have supplied no real need in the English vocabulary on the one hand. So they made their way into English simply as the result of the mixture of two peoples. Now, the words from both the languages were being used side by side, probably, and the survival of one or the other most often have been a matter of chance. Now, if this happens to a great extent, then that can also act as a stimulant in uniting people. And we can find examples of the same in India itself. So, in India, Ladakhi language can be understood simply in terms of spoken and written language or classical Tibetan. The classical Tibetan is generally known as Ghoti in Ladakh and Ige in Baltistan, whereas spoken or colloquial Ladakhi is called Palska. Now, spoken Ladakhi is the mother tongue or first language of the people of Ladakh that identifies and designates certain group of people across the Trans-Himalayan region. The spoken Ladakhi differs from colloquial Tibetan and it does not exactly follow the Tibetan grammar system. It uses ample of archaic and classical Tibetan terms that are somehow lesser used in contemporary spoken Tibetan. Neither a Ladakhi can converse in Tibetan nor can a Tibetan in Ladakhi. Therefore, a Ladakhi can be bound up with the Tibetan people and its literature through learning classical Tibetan only. So, in Ladakh, both the Buddhist and Muslim communities communicate in native Ladakhi, though the latter one also follows Urdu language and uses Perso Arabic script for writing. The spoken Ladakhi is not confined to Buddhist community only. It is used by Muslim and Christian communities as well as in their day-to-day life from the time of their ancestors. So further, it also works as a bridge that connects different faith followers into one unit. But sadly enough, the politics that lies behind borrowing doesn't always produce positive results. Here, let me share another example through which I'd like to substantiate what I have just said. So, I would like to mention Mahashweta Devi, the renowned literature from India, who has written many fictional and non-fictional narratives on tribal life, mostly in Bangla. And to represent the tribal reality, she has resorted to give shape to the oral narratives of the tribal people, which has been effectively brought to use while documenting their lives with precision. Now, in redacting the tribal realities learned from those oral narratives, she has to transfigure them in the scribal medium. even though the Indian vernaculars are related to the ethnographic reality of Bangla as a part of the Indo-Aryan group of languages and also share the cultural terrain, it wasn't enough for Devi to present their stories completely in Bangla. So, in fact, her stories are not always written in quote unquote standard Bangla dialect. Rather, she continuously has mixed them up with different tribal dialects, doggerels, slangs at times, and also she has mixed them up with frequent intervention of Hindi and English. So these words that become a common phenomena, the insertion of words from Hindi and English, it has become a common phenomenon post the introduction of the three language structure, three language policy in the education system of independent India. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that for the sake of authenticity, even while representing the narratives of the tribal people of India, uh, Mahashita Devi has used Indian vernaculars, but it was also important to constantly bring in linguistic elements from the tribal languages of the tribal communities. Now, the reason behind this is that the sheer fact that due to long history of borrowed words and interactions and through the interactions and associations, most of the tribal languages have imbibed and incorporated words from from languages like Bangla, Hindi, and English. And it is also noteworthy here that all these languages enjoy the privilege of more prestige than the so-called tribal languages. So here is a case where the international language and the comparatively dominant regional languages have had their moments of imposition on the tribal language. So, hence, from this, I would like to conclude with the idea that naturalizing of the borrowed words or other linguistic elements cannot simply deny the inherent politics or imposition that goes behind any such borrowing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was very interesting to hear the last point that you mentioned. In that way, we could also say that since English has borrowed from so many languages all over the world, um, they have borrowed from the Sanskrit. Like a very prominent example would be karma or even dharma, something that we see very being very popular. So the point that you were mentioning or were trying to make was that these using these words doesn't necessarily mean that people are getting to know more about the Sanskrit language or putting Sanskrit in a position. Rather, like what does borrowing these words do to Sanskrit, and what do they do to English?
So actually, there are several layers, as I've mentioned in my talk, to borrowing. So when words are borrowed from one language to another language, of course, there is a long history of interaction between the two languages. But mostly, what we have seen is that when one language borrows from the other language, the language from which words are borrowed is comparatively more an enriched language and excuse me, there is some disturbance, and it is a language of more prestige. Now when another language comes in contact to that language, like in this case you have mentioned Sanskrit, what generally happens is that the language from which words are borrowed remains almost intact or unaltered, because as I mentioned, the this is a one way process mostly, and the source language from which words are borrowed remains almost unchanged in most of the cases, but the language which imbibes or incorporates words generally gets enriched through this transaction or through this interaction. So in we can conclude that both the languages are not affected. Only the language that borrows remains, gets affected and becomes more enriched, but the source language remains almost unaltered.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. Next, we will move on to Dr. Somrita Urni Ganguly. Ma'am, over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Shania, for that very warm welcome and introduction. Hello to everyone that's also joined us on our live stream. We hope to be able to taking questions and comments from you as well. Um, Apologies right at the start. I'm dealing with a bout of cough and cold, so I might have to excuse myself a bit while I'm talking, but we'll try and take this forward as we can, as best as we can. um, so we're talking about borrowing, mixing, and naturalizing language, and I will be talking about the language that I feel I know better than certain others. So I will be talking about English today and what borrowings have done, how we are continuing to borrow. I'm very grateful to Sharmila for that. She started out with a very solid theoretical introduction to the process, and I hope to be able to take you through a more experiential understanding of the process, my experiences, especially as a literary translator from Hindi and Bangla into English, and how I feel um, we as literary translators, as writers, Nishi, I'm sure will talk about her journey as a poet, how we can enrich languages, help languages grow through our experiences of working with these languages. But before I sort of go into like a full-fledged conversation, I want to read to you one of my favorite poems. It's a poem that I reference very often, especially when talking about English, especially when talking about English as a South Asian person. This is by Meena Kandasamy. If you give me just a second, I'll get the poem out so we can read it together. This one's called Maligatawny Dreams by Meena Kandasamy. Anaconda, candy, cash, catamaran, cheroot, coolie, curry, ginger, mango, Maligatawny. I dream of an English full of the words of my language, an English in small letters, an English that shall tire a white man's tongue, an English where small children practice with smooth round pebbles in their mouth to spell the right j, an English where a pregnant woman is simply stomach child lady, an English where love means only the strange frenzy between a man and his beloved and not between him and his car. An English without the privacy of its many rooms. An English with suffixes for respect. An English with more than 36 words to call the sea. An English of tasting with 5 fingers. This is an excerpt from the poem. You could read. You could read the entire poem online or in one of Meena Kandasamy's collections. I love this work. It starts out by telling us, or how I read the poem, it's is that language exists in a sort of no man's zone, in a no man's land. Who does English belong to? Who does Bangla belong to? Who does Hindi belong to? And what role are we playing when we get caught up in this idea of cultural chauvinism, linguistic hegemony? Are we playing the role of the protector and the preserver, or the role of the police? Are we playing the role of the gatekeeper or the guardian? Because there is a difference between the two. While one tries to protect and preserve, help to grow and nourish, the other is just being, that is the gatekeeper, is just being exclusive. It's trying to keep people out, it's trying to keep influences out. So, who do languages belong to anyway? In my mind, they belong to users, they belong to speakers. Whoever speaks the language, whoever uses it, makes the language his or her own. Um, to that extent, because language, I feel, philosophically exists in this sort of no man's land, it's also very comical when, we get all charged up when talking about something like, let's say, the mother tongue. It's a conundrum that I think we need to think about. There are political connotations associated with the mother tongue that we cannot ignore. There are problems that we need to dwell on, especially for people like me, or people that have been raised by bilingual parents, people that have been raised in different parts of the country or the world, or even raised in a place like India, which really is a melting point of languages and cultures. What really does the mother tongue mean? And in my context, I mean, this is not even as diverse as one parent speaking English and the other parent speaking French. So, what is my mother tongue? For me, it was even as complex as one parent speaking the Bangla, which is spoken in Bangladesh, formerly East Bengal, and the other parent speaking the Bangla, which is spoken in West Bengal. It is the same language with its various versions. What then is my mother tongue? Do I speak the language of my mother? Do I speak the language of my father? Do I speak a language that is divorced from both of these, but that I feel I'm able to think in, dream in, express in the best? For me, the answer turned out to be the last. I chose a different language for myself. Part of it was done by my parents. But, when we talk about languages, borrowing, mixing, and naturalizing, these are questions that we have to go into. Sharmila was talking about how the English language itself, she touched on it briefly, has been influenced by other languages, right? So there have been different waves of influences that led to the development of the language as we speak today. There were, three waves of the Latin influence. There was the French influence. Um, People like Shakespeare and Milton created their own words, and that too led to the evolution of the language. And then, of course, later day loan words from the American, from the Indian languages, from other South Asian languages. So, to me, it really shows the flexibility of a language, the flexibility of a culture, and the flexibility of a people if they're able to, for want of a better word now, borrow from so many different language and cultural systems and contexts. And something that I, just slightly disagree with, an idea that sort of Sharmila touched on, is that sometimes these borrowed words serve no real purpose. I don't quite entirely agree, because I don't think borrowings are always for an ornamental role. I think there is also a deeply intrinsically functional role that these borrowings play. I mean, today there are 900 words or more of Indian origin in the Oxford English Dictionary. And honestly, I don't think we, of Indian, so I honestly don't think we would have been borrowing so many words from Indian languages if they did not serve any real purpose, if they had really just sort of like a rhetorical, ornamental role. I mean, I also made a list of some of these words, if we can just take a look at them very quickly. And while I read them out, if you think of two things. Number one, what could have been the English equivalent of this word in the absence of the Indian language word? And therefore, what role is this Indian language word playing in the English language? Words like, I probably have, like, I've made a list of 15 or so. As I said, there are about 900 to 1,000 words today. Adda, avatar, Bengal, bungalow, Kashmir, chutney, Kamarband, Dini, Dharma, you already mentioned Sharanya, karma, in the same context, yoga, and then go downs, gymkhanas, Jodhpurs, jungle, jute, khaki, lacquer, loot, mantra, mayana, nirvana, palanquin, pashmina, pakka, pandit, parda, pajamas, raita, roti, shawl, shampoo, tiffin, tug, veranda. I mean, I tried to arrange the ones that I chose in sort of an alphabetical order, but really, what is the role of all these words in the English language? If it was not serving any functional role, and if it was just there for ornamentation, I think the borrowings would have stopped, right? So that is something we can think about, we can discuss further. Sharmila also used a very interesting word, seasoning. I like to use another loan word as it were. I also find the concept of the loan word very interesting because, when you talk about a loan, the understanding is that it's going to be returned or paid back in some time. So I wonder what happens when languages loan words from one another. Do they ever really pay back, and what is the payback, right? So instead of seasoning, I like to use another loan word, chutneyfying. So what purpose does chutneyfying a language, or in specific chutneyfying the English language, serve? Right. um for this, I like to go back to something that Kabir had talked about, because we've discussed a little bit about Sanskrit and what happens to the language that English is, let's say, borrowing from. Now, Kabir, as you know, did not really write in Sanskrit. He was writing in a language which later critics would call the Panchmel Khichdi. There was, so he wasn't even, not only not writing in Sanskrit, not even writing in standardized Hindi. He was writing in a combination of languages. There was a little bit of Methli, a little bit of Braj, a little bit of Avdhi, obviously words from the Sanskrit and standard Hindi as well. But and when asked why he was doing that, he used a very interesting analogy. And he said the Sanskrit language is like kupajal, that is the water in a well, and it remains in the well and it doesn't flow, so it's stagnant. After a point, it grows moss. And what do you do with water of that kind? You cannot use it for too long. For him, bhasha is essentially like a river, or should be like a river that is flowing, that is ever evolving, that is ever growing, right? So with that sort of, that is sort of like, I was talking about all of this because this is sort of the ideological position with which I work as a literary translator when I'm translating from the Bangla or Hindi or Urdu into English. Something that it took me 5 years of working professionally to get to this place, but by now I'm willing to have conversations with my editors in the UK or the US, where I'm willing to defend certain linguistic choices that I make, because I am unwilling to, completely surrender um, all the kinks and quirks of my language to make my translation read uh, very white, so to speak, to make my translation completely whitewashed, to make it more, palatable for the sort of white English reader who does not have access to a culture that is 14,000 miles away, a language that is 14,000 miles away from them. Except that I'm willing, by now I'm willing to have these conversations with editors to let them see that And there's also something that came up very frequently with my mentor, Sharanya mentioned. I was at the BCLT Literary Translation Summer School, and my mentor, Denny Han, and I, we would talk about this frequently. When you say that the English language is supposed to do this and the English language is not supposed to do that, what really are you implying? Because the moment you make these claims, you make the language stagnant, you make it like kupajal. Instead, I think our approach should be where we say the English language has not done this yet, but it can. And again, for want of a better word, borrowings from other languages. I prefer using the word influence. I prefer using the word interaction. Interactions with other languages helps every language and therefore every culture grow. So, I mean, you would probably have noticed this when you're reading an English book. You would probably find words like, not so much now, but even 5 or 6 years ago, you would probably find words like idli or dosa or rasgulla italicized, or there is a glossary, and the glossary explains what this word means, or there is a meaning given and the meaning is so long that it almost starts reading like the recipe of idli. Whereas this is not being done when we are talking about, let's say, enchilada in English. I don't see enchiladas highlighted. I don't see bibimbap highlighted or italicized, right? So this is the kind of conversation I've started having with my editors now, where I say Rasgulla doesn't need to be italicized in the English language when I'm translating. I will massage in a little bit of an explanation. I could say, for example, and at the end of dinner, they had a dessert. They had something sweet, comma, syrupy rasgullas. So that way, I'm giving some context to a reader who might not have access at all. Though, that too is sort of like a, absurd presumption, especially in the world of the internet. But let's say there is somebody who exists in the sort of insular space that has no idea of what this other language or culture is, that has no access to the internet. So then I will massage in a little bit of information or meaning for this kind of a reader, but I don't need to go overboard. And with me introducing, with my comrades, with other literary translators, with other writers, introducing little words like that. If we can go back to this line that Meena Kandasamy writes in the poem, she says I can't find the exact line, but anyway, something to the effect of where she says, I want the English language to have rooms for hyphenated terms, for hyphenated words of respect that you do not have in English. So earlier, when I first started out, I would probably just turn everything to, Miss Nishi or Mr. Rohit if I was translating, but now I don't. I would actually keep it as Nishi Di, Sarmila D, or Sharanya G. I do use these hyphens now because for me, as I said, which is why I gave you sort of like the ideological position that I come from, I feel this is what will push the envelope of the language. This is what is going to make the language grow. And obviously, within the community, also, there are people that do not always subscribe to this philosophy, and they would think that this is a dirty translation. And I obviously vehemently put my foot down because I don't think something different is necessarily dirty. If you've not read it, it only means you've not read it yet, that you're going to read it in the future. Um, with sort of these thoughts, I want to wrap up this part of the discussion so we can hear Nishidi speak, and then also go into the question and answer session. But sort of, when it comes to my position on borrowings, mixings, naturalizing, my position is that I like to let my language wander a bit, whether that is Bangla, whether that is Hindi, or whether that is English. I like to let my language wander a bit get lost a little bit in neighboring fields, and come out of it with mud on its feet. I think that mud is good, and I don't think my language needs to be so clean that it is palatable to every reader. I think all of us can handle a little bit of indigestion. It is good for the stomach, it is good for our gut. And that's how I like to play with my language. And I feel the more we play, the more we are able to help it grow. Instead of the language owning me, I like to own the language, because what is the purpose of language? To communicate. And if you cannot let the language communicate, then, what is the point of rules and grammar and structure if the person in front of you doesn't even understand what you are saying? So, yeah. So that's how I like to look at language. It's something that I like to sleep with in my bed, and I'm not always washing my bed sheet.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was, I mean, I'm at loss of words. It was so engaging. It was thoroughly engaging, and I have a lot of questions in my mind. But before asking questions, I think I'll move over to Dr. Nishi first.
Yeah.
Dr. Nishi, please present your views on today's topic.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me over in this discussion on borrowing, mixing, and naturalizing of language. And I'm so glad I got to hear of Somrita before I begin whatever I have to say, because much of what I'm going to say has to do with personal experiences, just almost in tune with what Somrita is saying. She's talking from the point of view of predominantly a translator. I'm going to talk to you from the point of someone who moves between languages, four languages, with equal ease. And when you talk about a naturalizing language, the ease with which I'm able to move between four very different languages. One, of course, is English. The other is Bangla, Hindi, and my mother tongue, Telugu. So I'm going to speak about, from personal experiences, of how I've seen me moving across languages and various people around me who, like me, speak in a multiplicity of languages and equally comfortable in all of them. I completely agree with what Somrita says about the idea of a loan word. It always reminds me of having to return something. I've borrowed it and I need to return. And I would rather like to put it as a way in which we easily, with a lot of ease, move between multiple languages, not bothering to think from which language I've chosen my particular words. I'm just speaking them as they come to my mind. And at times, unless of course I'm in my classroom, otherwise, when I'm talking with friends or at home, I'm moving very easily across languages. Um, I also like this idea of chutnification which Somrita spoke, because I was thinking of referring to chutney, not of course to chutney, but to what in Telugu is called a pachadi, which is actually what a chutney is called in Telugu. And by now, quite a number of my friends on social media and elsewhere have learned this Telugu word for pachadi, simply because throughout the pandemic, I've been talking a lot about Telugu cuisine. And I've been talking, therefore, a lot about pachadi or a chutney. So, to this group of friends around me, Bengali speaking friends or non Telugu speaking friends, they're now comfortable with the word pachadi and do not need me to explain what the meaning of this word is. And I think this is the way in which words in the Indian, I'm talking specifically in the Indian context, specifically with reference to me and my personal experiences. I think this is the way in which words from one language enter into another with great ease. When I joined this college where I teach, I remember the then principal, in my first conversation with him, had asked me a question for which I don't have an answer. I never thought about it. He'd asked me, that you speak Bengali very fluently. He was talking to me in Bangla. he said, "You speak Bengali very fluently. How fluent are you in your mother tongue?" And then he asked me something. He asked me, "What is the language of my dreams?" I didn't have an answer to that question. I don't have an answer to that even now. I'm not very sure. I've never thought about the language of my dreams. But I think what he was trying to do, he was trying to find out which is the language that is possibly closer to my heart, which is the language that is possibly one with which I am most comfortable in. But then growing up in Bengal, growing up in Kolkata, belonging to a Telugu speaking family, growing up in North Kolkata to be specific, I grew up with multiple languages that were part of my being. The first language that I learned obviously was my mother tongue, Telugu. But I think the other language that almost simultaneously that entered into my world is Bangla. And even today, at times, I might get stuck talking in Telugu at times and have to think about which word to use. But that doesn't happen with Bangla. A few years later, as it was time for me to go to school, English was spoken at home. So these were the three languages. And I shifted very easily from one language to another with great ease. And I never felt that, and not just moving from one language to another, but using specific words. Like, for instance, I use specific Telugu words even while I'm talking in Bangla. For instance, and this is something that everyone in my house does, my nephew does it as well, where I have to refer to the garbage, I will say tukku, which is a Telugu word. And each one of us uses this word while referring to garbage. We'll always use the Telugu word no matter what language we're talking. For a sheet that we're going to use at night to sleep, we'll always use the Telugu word duppati. So it's almost as if that is what our language is about. And it's become so much natural that we don't even think that that's not Bangla, or that's not English, or that's not Hindi, or that's not something else, something to do with the language that I am talking about. I think that just has become so much a natural part of our growing up, natural part of the language that we use. And I think that's because of these multiple languages that we're using with equal ease. I've just been back from a trip to Hyderabad after a very long time, and a friend was talking about the fact that I must have been speaking a lot in Telugu during my entire trip, which of course is a fact. I don't get to speak much Telugu in Kolkata. And that reminded me of the fact that as children, as very small children, when we went home, when we went to Andhra Pradesh, to Kakinada for a holiday, both me and my sister, who spoke fluent Bangla, would come back after the holiday trip, forgetting much of the Bangla and only speaking Telugu. Not just forgetting, I think it was not completely forgetting Bangla, but kind of feeling lost after having listened to Telugu for such a very long time. And it would take us, I remember our neighbors and friends making fun of the fact that we must have forgotten Bangla. And it would take us just a week or a couple of days to get back to speaking Bangla once again, just the way we spoke, very, very comfortably. And I was just thinking about this because I think these personal experiences speak a lot about the way a number of people in India who speak a number of languages, because they don't stay in this state where their mother tongue is spoken, they stay elsewhere. And because of school and college, because of the fact that we have so many different languages, almost all of us learn Hindi, and we learn Hindi and English, and the language that is spoken in the state that we live in. So there are these multiple languages that become so much a part of our growing up. And I was just as I was reading up, as I was preparing for this particular panel discussion, as thinking, gathering my thoughts, one of the things that I came across is that that there are studies which show that parents of bilingual children often are alarmed to see their children move back and forth between several languages mid sentence. And there has been it has been thought that this switching between back and forth between several languages in the middle of one sentence has often been characterized and possibly misunderstood, I would feel, as a sign of confusion on the part of the child. And not only that, even in popular culture or even in literature, we often find out that this mixing of languages is not a very good idea. And one might even encounter people telling us that this is not how it should happen. One needs to speak one language throughout. But I think this is an old-fashioned way of looking at things. And I think most recent studies and personal experiences tell me very, very clearly that this mixed use of language, this switching back and forth between languages mid sentence, mid thought, I think is a very natural and a very, very positive development in people who use multiple languages. Right. And, we had Charmila talking about code switching and borrowing. I don't want to use these terms as such, but we see all of that happening in the language with great ease. I noticed this change in language coming upon very, 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 very closely when I noticed my nephew growing up. His mother, my sister, her mother tongue is Telugu, but then we speak, as I said, fluent Bangla because of having grown up in Kolkata. And his father is a Bengali. So he grew up learning Bangla. And then when he moved out of Kolkata, when he first went abroad for some time, he was in Helsinki, the little child. He was just around 1.5, 2 years old. And there, once again, he had a lot of problems adjusting to the language. They came back to India after a couple of years. That was the time when he just began school. And this time he was in Rajasthan, so he had to pick up Hindi. And it was very difficult for him to come to terms with the language. And most of the time he didn't want to go to school. But what I want to point out here is as he began to grow up in North India, I noticed he was speaking Bangla fluently before. Of course, he does use a number of Telugu words the same way that we did, as I spoke about a little while ago. And what I noticed in his Bangla, as he was living in North India, as they continue to live in North India, is the way in which he was changing these Bangla words in order to kind of fit in, or in order to where the nuances of the Hindi language were slowly being visible in the way in which he's using the Bangla words. And here, for the first time, I was able to see the influence of these various languages on a child who is growing up, who has these multiple languages around him. For instance, I remember vividly when he's doing something and he wants you to sit still. In Bangla, you say, Norbe na, do not move, right? And he used to say hilbe na, right? Which is, he's using Hindi out here, hilna mat. And with that, he's adding the Bangla version, and he's kind of creating a language of his own. And this is a language which, not just of his own, but a kind of language with many other children in the place that he was growing up were speaking as well. To press a switch on the lift, for instance, he says dabiye dao, which is dabado, and tipe dao in Bangla. So he's mixing up all of these languages. And I think that is but natural for someone who is having to deal with so many languages. There are more and more Hindi words which are coming into his lexicon as he goes along speaking, as he goes along living in North India. So I think that this is something that we see very much in India, because, as I said, and this is something which Somrita was also talking about, where we are very comfortable, where we are not, so to speak, borrowing. I would not like to use the word borrowing out here, because we're just taking what we feel is comfortable, what possibly best expresses what I want to say. without really bothering whether it is the right expression or not, because ultimately, when I am using a language, I'm using it to communicate. That is what is most important. And here is a child who is initially struggling between languages, and then trying to find a comfortable zone where he's able to use both the languages in just the way that he wants to. So I think this is something that we notice very much with a number of people in India. I've seen this happening with me. I see this happening with my nephew as well. And I don't think that there is any kind of confusion, any kind of difficulty when we are moving from one language to another. And I think when we are moving between one language to another, and this is, as I said, is very common to a number of people who use multiple languages, I think this moving between languages is one way in which we communicate, one way in which we are able to use linguistic skill. The child is possibly using the most appropriate word that the child thinks is right at that point of time, without really bothering whether it is an accurate usage or not. And the word the child is using from two Indian languages. Sometimes the word is from Hindi, sometimes the word is from Bangla, but the child is using this kind of a word, creating almost a new kind of word, naturalizing, bringing together these two languages to express what the child feels is the best way of expressing. And I think that is something that is very interesting when we think of us Indians using so many languages, using multiple languages, and being very, very comfortable with each of these languages that we engage in. And I think if we could study them even more, in a much more better way, in a much more organized way, then I think these would be easily observable results of intercultural contact, of the way in which communication works, the way in which someone who is at home in multiple languages is able to move between each of them with ease. So I think that's about it, and I'm willing to take up questions and queries.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, the thing that you mentioned about growing up in a bilingual household, this is a very personal experience, because my parents are I have been brought up in a bilingual household too. My mom, she speaks Hindi, and but then my dad, he speaks Bengali. So whenever I'm like when I was younger, so say I'm visiting my mom's side of the family, and I stay there for too long, and then I'm constantly speaking Hindi with them, and then I come back home, and then I'm interacting with my dad's side of the family, and then they used to say, "Tu to Bangla bhule gechish." I was like, because there are certain things that you inject, and even now whenever say I am this thing about constantly switching languages mid sentence, or when you're speaking, it still happens to me. And sometimes say the people are meeting for the first time, or maybe they don't know me that well, they will be like, is Bengali your mother tongue? Because you don't speak Bengali like uh you know like a Bengali. They're like, no, I mean, so I think the thing that you mentioned about imposition of one language, using that structure on the other language, that was very relatable, because that happens to me a lot.
Yeah, and Somrita raised the point about the mother tongue. That also becomes a
Yeah,
big issue. What is your
yeah,
mother tongue? My nephew, he doesn't speak Telugu excepting a few words here and there, right? Because Bangla is the language that is spoken at his home. He's learned Bangla, English, Hindi. A few words, the words that, as I was talking about, few words that we use, that those are the few words that he speaks. So, what is his mother tongue? And I think this is something that Somrita was talking about, and this is something that applies to a number of people, who are of us in India, who straddle so many different languages, and we are comfortable with all of them.
Right. Ma'am, I wanted to ask you something about the thing that you mentioned about many people saying, speak one language properly. Why are you switching? Or if you're speaking English, then and speak in English, like speak a full sentence. So why do you think there is this need to maintain a purity? Something that also Shomrita ma'am mentioned about being palatable to the reader, or even when you're like speaking.
Yeah, I think they're very puritanical that way. I think we want it everything to be perfect, and I liked what Shomrita said about not mentioning, not giving the meaning of dosa, or even underlining a word like dosa or rasgulla, which even I never do when I write these days. I do not italicize any word. Right, I'm sure whether if people can understand it from the context, well and good, or they can always Google it up. Because why do I need to explain things? If I'm writing someone's name as Mashi, I assume that my reader will know, or if they don't, will find out. And with language, I mean, I think they're very puritanical. Okay, I mean, I understand if you have to give a formal speech, then you need to be very particular about a language. But if not, if you're using it for daily conversation, and if you are very comfortable moving from one language to another, I don't see any reason. On the other hand, psychiatrists and neurologists say that the more languages you are comfortable with, the more languages you are at home, and the more languages you learn, that's actually beneficial for your brain health. Right. So I think that there isn't much of, it's not as if I'm confused, therefore I am switching between languages. It's not as if I'm getting muddled also with my thought as I'm moving between English and Bangla, or Bangla and Telugu, or English and Telugu. It's not like that. My thought process is absolutely all right. It's just that I'm comfortable when I'm doing it, and I'm not always consciously doing it as well, unless of course I'm doing a public presentation where I need to stick to one language. But if I am having a conversation with friends around, or with family around, and these jumps happen very, very smoothly, and I don't see why there should be any problem with it. I think that actually allows you to learn many more languages, because I would like to refer to the example of my mother, who got married and came to Kolkata. She knew she knew Telugu, English, and she learned Hindi, so she knew that. And when in Kolkata, she learned Bangla because she realized if she didn't, then that would be problem, handling the help at home or going to the bazaar. And she was self-taught, right? She learned speaking with everyone that she encountered. And not just that, she learned to read and write by reading billboards and posters and things like that. I mean, she could read quite well. In a Bangla paper also she could read, but she was completely self-taught because she wanted to. And of course, she spoke Bangla with a Hindi accent and with a South Indian accent, but she was determined to speak Bangla when it would be time to speak Bangla. Right. So I think it's about, being comfortable in language, and each language has so much of its cultural nuances, so much of its culture, so much of things to learn from each of these languages. Not just the language that you're learning, but there's so much to that language that you're also learning. And I think that's something which is very, very important. Shomrita spoke about cultural chauvinism and linguistic chauvinism. And I think, I really think, I would love to learn as many languages, because with that language comes so many other things which I don't know, and I would surely like to know, right? Whether it's about cuisine or about literature, about culture. So I think these are very important. I mean, language is not just about communication, not just learning to speak or be able to read or write, but also to know all of this, to learn different cultures.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The thing that you mentioned about not italicizing certain words that maybe not very very popular with all over the world. I remember reading this book. This is also the question that I want to address to Somrita ma'am, because um, I was reading this book, I think 2 years back during the pandemic. It was Neil Mukherjee's The Lives of Others. So it's a very fat book, and it was very engrossing. I could not put it down. So but then he talked about a Bengali middle class family, that, and for that there has been thousands of Bengali terms, and at the end of the book there was, I think, a 7 page or a 6 page glossary that was provided. There was like achol, katha, a lot of things that. But then now, when I'm studying African literature as part of my syllabus, I'm in the fifth semester. So I see there's this novel by Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. So he has absolutely, I mean, there are so many words we get absolutely confused. We keep on asking, ma'am, what is ogobanje, obe? We have no idea. Why didn't he, at least provide a footnote or a glossary? Because that was the thing that we were accustomed with. So my teacher said the very same thing that Dr. Nishi pointed out here, that if you want to know, if you're reading this book, you'll also know about his culture. So look it up. It is not his job to, make you aware of what he's writing about. Something also that we see in the Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh, that he has not really even italicized words. So the question is, do you think this is a very this is a very silent, this is a very effective tool of combating cultural imperialism?
Yeah, absolutely, Sharanya. Cultural imperialism, linguistic hegemony, linguistic chauvinism, very effective tool. But also, the thing is, each writer makes a choice for herself. So not everybody is going to be comfortable uh, using words from a particular language and then providing a glossary. That is just one way of going about it. Somebody might consider not even providing the glossary, and somebody might be comfortable with italicizing the word just to show you there is a slight difference, but it's still a part of the same process, right? So, so for people who ask me that question, what does this word mean in Bangla? Or why did he, leave in words, because you were talking about Achebe, words from the Igbo language, in the English? My question is simple. When you read Shakespeare, do you understand every word that Shakespeare has used? Forget Shakespeare. That was 400 years ago. When you read, let's say, William Dalrymple, writing in modern English, as it were, do you understand every word? You don't. That is why dictionaries exist. So if you're able to use a dictionary for a word in English that you don't understand, you might as well use a dictionary for a word which sounds a little unfamiliar to you, but you understand the context. As I mentioned, in the current world of the internet, you cannot be so insular that you say that I have to be spoon fed everything. Having said that, obviously, these are choices that writers make. And to impose my choice on another writer would also be a form of hegemony. So I really allow, I'm nobody to allow or disallow. I really let people take the path that they do, but this is the path that I would follow to combat this sort of hegemony, and especially through literary translation. I think of literary translation as a form of social activism. I think of literary translation as a form of, or as an attempt to decolonize the English language. Um, and we're making progress there, I feel. Slow but steady.
Right. I think we are actually way past time. So I'll wind up by asking one more question to Sharmila ma'am. So the last question is, do you think that when we the scope of language mixing, or borrowing or naturalizing of language, is more profound that in writing a language, say English writing, than speaking a language?
Yeah, I think it's actually the other way around. So, as both the other speakers, Nishi ma'am and Somrita ma'am has pointed out, while speaking, it gives you the fluidity to use the language that you are comfortable using with. Yeah, so when speaking, we don't always think about the way we are mixing or naturalizing the languages, or sometimes multiple languages come into play, as Nishi ma'am has rightly said. So while writing, we rather become conscious, and we try to a certain extent to maintain the one language, quote unquote, the purity. So I have objections to this word too, but while speaking, that gives us the liberty, and of course, the chances are more that we switch from one language to the other in a more flexible way, and more frequently. So
Thank you so much, ma'am. As I mentioned earlier, that we are way past time, but this was. Thank you so much, everyone. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Somrita Urni Ganguly, Dr. Sharmila Paul, and Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha for this remarkable session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.
thank you, Shamina.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharanya.